Hello and welcome. The question of who you truly are becomes far more complicated when there are dozens of you, each convinced beyond doubt that they are the genuine article. You might think identity is simple, that the person who lived the experiences owns those memories. But what happens when magic allows those exact same memories, that precise consciousness, to exist in multiple bodies simultaneously? This is not a thought experiment whispered in philosophical academies. This is the reality that tore apart one of Faerun's most powerful organizations and plunged the Zhentarim into decades of bloody civil war. The man at the center of this crisis was Manshoon, and understanding his story means confronting uncomfortable truths about what makes any of us real. You need to understand who Manshoon was before everything fractured, before his identity became a battlefield claim rather than an undisputed fact. Manshoon was born in 1229 Dale Reckoning in Gentle Keep, a city on the Moonsea that would become synonymous with tyranny and dark ambition. His father, Harlshoon, was the first lord of Gentle Keep, a powerful warrior who commanded the city's military forces. From birth, Manshoon was positioned at the pinnacle of power, but he was not content to rest on inherited authority. From his earliest days studying the arcane arts, Manshoon demonstrated the kind of ruthless ambition that transforms talented mages into legendary wizards. He did not simply learn spells. He mastered them, perfected them, and then bent them to purposes their creators never imagined. By the time Manshoon reached adulthood, he had already established himself as a force to be reckoned with among Faerun's magical elite. His intelligence was matched only by his capacity for cold calculation. Where other wizards might hesitate at moral boundaries, Manshoon saw only obstacles to be overcome or ignored entirely. He understood something fundamental about power that many of his contemporaries failed to grasp. True power was not just about personal magical ability. It was about organization, about building structures that would amplify and perpetuate your influence long after you left the room. This understanding led Manshoon to found the Zhentarim in 1261 Dale Reckoning. The organization was his creation alone, a tool designed to extend his reach far beyond what any individual wizard could achieve. Manshoon recruited powerful individuals to help build his network, including F. Saul Kembril, a prominent priest of Bane who brought divine backing, and a contingent of clerics to the cause. He also enlisted skilled mages like Semaman, who would later become one of his most trusted lieutenants. But make no mistake, the Zhentarim was Manshoon's vision, Manshoon's creation, and for decades, it would be Manshoon's instrument of power. The Black Network, as it came to be known, was not just another mercenary company or thieves' guild. Under Manshoon's guidance, it became a sophisticated web of influence that reached into every corner of Faerun's economy, politics, and underworld. In 1312 Dale Reckoning, Manshoon demonstrated his growing power by seizing the fortress of Darkhold from a Lich Queen named Varela. He granted control of this strategic stronghold to Semimin, elevating his apprentice to the inner circle of the Zhentarim alongside Efzaul. This move extended Zhentarim influence deep into the Western Heartlands, while keeping potential rivals at a safe distance from the politics of Zhentil Keep. You have to appreciate the sheer scope of what Manshoon built. The Zhentarim established trade routes, controlled entire cities, infiltrated noble houses, and manipulated regional conflicts to their advantage. Manshoon himself became one of the most powerful wizards in Faerun, rivaling even the legendary members of groups like the Red Wizards of Thay. His personal power grew alongside the organization he had created. He developed new spells, acquired powerful magical items, and built a network of informants and agents that gave him eyes and ears across the continent. But with power came paranoia, and Manshoon had good reason to be paranoid. When you build an empire on treachery and manipulation, you can never quite trust that those same tools will not be turned against you. The Zhentarim's leadership was a viper's nest of competing ambitions. Efzaul had his own designs on ultimate control. Semimin pursued his mysterious agendas. Countless other powerful individuals within the organization saw Manshoon as either a stepping stone to greater power or an obstacle to be removed. Assassination attempts became part of Manshoon's daily reality. Magical wards protected his strongholds. Divination spells checked for threats. Contingency magic stood ready to save him from sudden death. Yet even with all these precautions, Manshoon knew the fundamental truth about mortality. No defense was perfect. No ward was impenetrable. No magical protection could guard against every possible threat. Eventually, someone would get lucky. Someone would find the gap in his defenses. Someone would strike when he was vulnerable. Death was not a question of if, but when. For most people, this realization leads to acceptance, to making peace with mortality. For Manshoon, it led to something far more ambitious and ultimately far more catastrophic. Manshoon decided that if he could not prevent death, he would simply make it meaningless. He would ensure that killing him once would not be enough. Even if his enemies succeeded in destroying his body, even if they celebrated over his corpse, Manshoon would return, not as an undead creature bound by the limitations of that existence, not as a ghost or specter, but as himself, fully alive, fully powered, ready to reclaim everything that was stolen from him. This was not about survival in some diminished form. This was about genuine continuity, about making death nothing more than a temporary inconvenience. The solution Manshoon developed was brilliant in its elegance and terrifying in its implications. He would create clones of himself, perfect duplicates grown through powerful magic, and place them in stasis throughout Faerun and beyond. These were not simple copies. Each clone was magically linked to Manshoon through incredibly complex enchantments. The clones contained his memories up to the point of their creation, preserved in magical suspension until they were needed. When Manshoon updated the spell, new memories and experiences would be transferred to the dormant clones, keeping them current with his life. The magic involved in creating and maintaining these clones was extraordinarily sophisticated. Clone spells were already among the most challenging and expensive magic a wizard could attempt. They required significant material components, extensive casting time, and deep understanding of both necromancy and transmutation. But Manshoon did not stop at simply casting the clone's spell multiple times. He enhanced it, modified it, and integrated it with contingency magic that would activate under specific conditions. The key to Manshoon's system was the trigger mechanism. He crafted magical conditions that would detect his death and immediately activate his clones. The moment his original body died, magical energy would pulse across the network of stasis chambers he had established. Each clone would awaken, fully aware of everything Manshoon had experienced up until the moment the magic was last updated. They would open their eyes with his memories, his knowledge, his personality, his ambitions, and his absolutely unshakable conviction that they were Manshoon. You need to understand the scope of this contingency plan. Manshoon did not create 2 or 3 backup clones. He created many, with sources suggesting anywhere from a dozen to potentially dozens of stasis clones scattered across Faerun. He hid them in Zhentarim strongholds and secreted them away in remote locations known only to himself. The exact number and locations were secrets Manshoon guarded fanatically. Because if enemies discovered the clone network, they could potentially destroy all the backups before killing the original. Each stasis chamber was a marvel of magical engineering. The clone floated in preservative fluids, surrounded by enchantments that kept it in perfect, suspended animation. Time did not touch these bodies. They did not age, did not decay, did not change in any way. They waited in absolute stillness, existing in a state between life and death, ready to spring into full vitality the instant the activation magic reached them. The chambers themselves were warded against detection, protected from scrying, and trapped against intruders. Manshoon took no chances with his insurance policy. The philosophical implications of this arrangement apparently never troubled Manshoon. Or if they did, he dismissed such concerns as irrelevant. He saw the clones as extensions of himself, as tools to ensure his survival. The question of whether each clone might be a separate person with their own identity never seemed to enter his calculations. After all, they had his memories, his personality, his magical knowledge. From Manshoon's perspective, any clone that awakened would simply be him, continuing his existence in a new body. The original would be dead, yes, but Manshoon would live on. identity would persist even as the physical form changed. What Manshoon failed to consider, or perhaps chose to ignore, was what would happen if the clones did not activate one at a time as intended. His plan assumed a simple succession. The original dies, one clone awakens. That clone becomes the new Manshoon, and life continues. The system was designed with the understanding that only one Manshoon would exist at any given time. The contingency magic should have ensured this, activating only a single clone while leaving the others in stasis as continued insurance against future deaths. But magic, especially magic as complex as Manshoon had created, does not always function exactly as planned. Magical theory is precise, but implementation can be vulnerable to countless variables. A tiny flaw in the enchantment, an unexpected interaction with other magic, interference from powerful entities, or simply the cosmic chaos that occasionally disrupts even the most carefully crafted spells. Any of these could cause the contingency to malfunction. And when you have staked your entire conception of immortality on magic working perfectly, a malfunction does not just mean failure. It means catastrophe. Manshoon continued his work within the Zhentarim for decades after creating his clone network. He accumulated more power, expanded the organization's influence, and made countless enemies. The clones waited in their chambers, silent and still, as Manshoon lived his life confident in his ultimate security. He had defeated death itself, or so he believed. Nothing could truly end his existence now. His consciousness would persist regardless of what happened to any individual body. He had achieved a form of immortality that even liches might envy, without the need to become undead or bind his soul to a phylactery. The years passed. Manshoon's power grew. The Zhentarim flourished under his guidance, becoming one of Faerun's dominant political and economic forces. His magical abilities reached heights that few wizards ever achieved. He developed new spells, crafted powerful magical items, and became known throughout the realms as one of the most dangerous and formidable archmages in existence. His name inspired fear in his enemies and respect in his allies. Everything was proceeding exactly as he had planned. But in the shadows of Manshoon's triumph, the seeds of disaster were already planted. The clone network waited, a ticking magical time bomb that would eventually detonate with consequences Manshoon never imagined. The very system he had created to ensure his survival would become the mechanism of his fragmentation. The contingency meant to preserve his identity would instead shatter it into competing claims to authenticity. The magic designed to make him immortal would instead create the most bizarre and destructive identity crisis Faerun had ever witnessed. All it would take was one death, one activation of the contingency magic, and Manshoon's carefully constructed immortality scheme would transform into something far stranger and far more terrible than anyone could have predicted. The Clone Wars were coming, and they would reshape not just Manshoon's existence, but the entire Zhentarim and the political landscape of Faerun itself. Section 2. The death that shattered reality. The event that triggered everything happened in 1370 Dale Reckoning, during a period of intense conflict within the Zhentarim's leadership. You have to understand that by this point, tensions between Manshoon and Efzal Kembril had reached a breaking point. These were not mere disagreements about strategy or policy. This was a fundamental power struggle between two incredibly ambitious men who both believed they should control the Black Network absolutely. Efzal had grown in strength and influence over the decades, his position as High Priest of Bane giving him divine backing that rivaled Manshoon's arcane might. The organization that Manshoon had founded now threatened to slip from his grasp as his lieutenant's ambitions grew. The confrontation came to a head when Manshoon and Efzal met, along with Lord Orgoth, and violence erupted. What began as a power struggle ended with Manshoon's death at the hands of his rivals. His body fell, his consciousness fled, and for one brief moment, the great Archmage who had ruled the Zhentarim for over a century simply ceased to exist. Efzal and his allies stood over their enemy's corpse, perhaps believing they had finally achieved control of the organization Manshoon had built. Whatever satisfaction they felt in those moments would prove short-lived, because they had fundamentally misunderstood what killing Manshoon would actually accomplish. The instant Manshoon's heart stopped beating, the contingency magic activated. The enchantments he had woven decades earlier recognized the termination of his life signs and responded exactly as designed. Magical energy pulsed outward from the point of death, racing across Faerun faster than thought, seeking out every stasis chamber Manshoon had created. The signal was clear and unambiguous. The original was dead. The clones must awaken. Continuity must be preserved. Manshoon must live on. But here is where everything went catastrophically wrong. The contingency was supposed to activate one clone, allowing for orderly succession. Instead, whether through a flaw in the original enchantment, interference from outside forces, or simply the chaotic nature of magic itself, the activation signal reached multiple clones simultaneously. Stasis chambers across Faerun received the wake-up call at the same instant. Every preservation spell dissolved. Every suspended animation ended. Multiple clones that Manshoon had created over the years suddenly drew their first independent breath. Imagine waking up from what feels like a moment of sleep to find yourself in a chamber you do not immediately recognize. Your last memory is of creating this clone, of the magical process that preserved your body, of the contingency being set in place. But now you are awake, and as consciousness floods back, you realize something has changed. The contingency has triggered. Your original body is dead. You are no longer a backup plan. You are Manshoon now, and you have work to do. Your enemies have killed you, and they will pay for it. The Zhentarim needs its leader back, and you are going to reclaim your position. This exact experience happened multiple times across Faerun in that same moment, to bodies that all believed themselves to be the same person. In hidden chambers beneath various Zhentarim strongholds, clones opened their eyes. In secret facilities scattered across the continent, others awakened. The locations varied, but the experience was identical. Each clone possessed the same memories, the same personality, the same absolute conviction that they were Manshoon, rightful leader of the Zhentarim, and that their death had been a temporary setback to be immediately corrected. The first few hours after activation were likely characterized by confusion and reorientation. Each clone had to assess their situation and begin making plans. Those who awoke in well-supplied facilities had immediate access to spell components, magical items, and resources. Others found themselves in more Spartan chambers, with only the basics needed for survival and escape. But regardless of their immediate circumstances, every clone shared the same fundamental goal. They needed to return to power, reclaim control of the Zhentarim, and deal with whoever had killed their original body. As these clones began to emerge into the wider world, the situation's strangeness became apparent. A Manshoon would arrive at a Zhentarim outpost, demanding recognition and obedience from agents who had no idea that anything unusual had happened. The agents would see their leader alive and apparently well, and naturally assume he had returned from whatever mission or research occupied him. They would report to him, take his orders, and go about their business. Everything would seem normal from their perspective. They had no way of knowing that in other locations, identical scenes were playing out with different Manshoons, giving different orders to different Zhentarim cells. The first hints that something was wrong likely came when Zhentarim agents started receiving contradictory commands. An operative might receive instructions from one Manshoon to secure certain assets, while days later, a different Manshoon would arrive demanding to know why different orders had not been followed, claiming he never issued the previous commands. Confusion rippled through the organization's ranks. Rumors began to spread. People whispered about doppelgangers, about magical deception, about enemies infiltrating the Zhentarim by impersonating their leader. But these were not imposters. Every single one was genuinely Manshoon, or at least had every right to claim that identity. They had his memories, his magical knowledge, his personality, his mannerisms, his speech patterns, his strategic thinking. Magical tests designed to detect imposters or shape-changers would have confirmed authenticity. Each clone passed every verification because they were not pretending to be Manshoon. They were Manshoon, at least from their own perspective, and by any magical or mundane measure available at the time. The moment of true realization when the clones understood what had actually happened, must have been extraordinary. Two individuals with identical memories encountering each other, each seeing in the other's eyes the same intelligence, the same personality, the same absolute certainty of self that they felt within themselves. Based on what we know about Manshoon's personality and the nature of the clone magic, these first meetings between clones were probably tense affairs, marked by confusion, giving way to calculation. Some clones might have initially assumed they were looking at other clones who had mistakenly activated. After all, they knew about the clone network. They had created it. But which one of them was the rightful heir to the Manshoon identity? Which one had the strongest claim to being the true continuation of their consciousness? These questions had no clear answers. The contingency magic had activated them simultaneously, or near enough that temporal priority could not be established. There was no first. There was no hierarchy. There were just multiple equally valid Manshoons, and only one of them could actually control the Zhentarim. The initial conflicts were probably exploratory in nature. These were all the same person, after all, with the same tactical brilliance and the same understanding of their own capabilities. Fighting yourself presents unique challenges. You know all your own tricks, all your preferred spells, all your combat strategies. Every Manshoon knew exactly what every other Manshoon would do in any given situation, because they would all tend toward the same choices. This created unusual dynamics, where conventional magical combat became complicated by perfect mutual knowledge. But not all the clones had identical information. This is where the temporal differences in their creation started to matter. Remember, each clone had been created at different points in Manshoon's life. Some were relatively recent, carrying memories of events from just months or weeks before the original's death. Others were older, their last memory update having occurred years earlier. These clones woke up to a world that had changed in ways they did not expect. Political situations had shifted. The Zhentarim had evolved. New enemies had emerged, and old allies had changed. These temporal differences created the first real distinctions between clones. A Manshoon whose last memories came from a decade prior would have 10 years of missing experiences. He would know the Zhentarim as it existed then, but the organization he encountered upon awakening would be different in ways both subtle and significant. This clone would need time to catch up, to learn what had happened in the intervening years, and to adjust strategies accordingly. Meanwhile, a clone updated more recently would have current knowledge, but might lack some of the perspective that comes from having lived through certain formative experiences the older clones possessed from earlier periods. The Zhentarim itself descended into chaos. Agents and operatives found themselves trying to navigate an organization where multiple versions of the Supreme Leader were all issuing orders, all demanding loyalty. and all claiming that the others were somehow false or less legitimate. Many Zhentarim members tried to stay neutral, attempting to wait out the confusion until a clear victor emerged. Others made calculated decisions about which Manshoon seemed strongest, most legitimate, or most likely to win the coming power struggle. Still, others saw opportunity in the chaos and tried to carve out their own power bases while the Manshoons were distracted with each other. F. Saul, who had started all this by killing the original Manshoon, suddenly found himself in an impossible position. He had eliminated one rival only to face multiple more, and these were not random pretenders he could easily dismiss. These were all genuinely Manshoon, with all the magical power, intelligence, and resources that name implied. The divine favor of Bane had helped him defeat one Manshoon, whether it could help him navigate a situation where numerous Manshoons now existed simultaneously was an entirely different question. The Zhentarim's network of alliances and partnerships began to fracture along the same lines as the organization itself. Trade contacts, political allies, and affiliated groups all had to decide how to respond to the situation. Some external parties saw opportunity, attempting to play different Manshoons against each other for their own benefit. Others withdrew entirely, unwilling to risk association with an organization in such obvious turmoil. The Black Network's reputation for ruthless efficiency was being replaced by a reputation for internal chaos and unreliability. Within weeks of the awakening, tensions between Manshoon factions escalated toward open conflict. The so-called Manshoon Wars had begun. Magical confrontations erupted in locations across Faerun. Zhentarim resources were mobilized not against external enemies, but against other Zhentarim forces following different Manshoons. Each clone sought to eliminate the competition and establish themselves as the sole legitimate Manshoon. The philosophical question underlying all this violence remained unresolved and perhaps unresolvable. Which Manshoon was real? Was it the one who controlled the most resources? The one with the most recent memories? Or were they all equally Manshoon, making the question itself meaningless? These were not merely academic debates. The answer would determine the future of one of Faerun's most powerful organizations and potentially shift the balance of power across the entire continent. You have to appreciate the sheer absurdity of the situation from an outside perspective. The Zhentarim's leader had died, but then multiple versions of him woke up, and they were all fighting each other for the right to be considered the real version of himself. It sounds almost comedic, like a scenario too bizarre to actually happen. But this was the reality that Faerun's power brokers had to navigate in the years following 1370 Dale Reckoning. The Clone Wars had begun, and they would rage for decades, reshaping the Zhentarim, destroying countless lives, and posing questions about identity and consciousness. that Faerun's greatest minds struggled to answer. Manshoon had sought immortality and gotten something far stranger. He had achieved a kind of multiplication of self that guaranteed his survival, but shattered any coherent sense of who he actually was. The man who had been one of Faerun's most powerful and feared wizards had become a multitude, and that multitude would tear itself apart trying to become one again. Section 3. The Clone Wars explode across Faerun. The war between the Manshoons transformed from confused skirmishing into prolonged conflict with shocking speed. You need to understand that these were not random battles or opportunistic strikes. Each Manshoon brought the same strategic brilliance to the conflict, which meant the warfare quickly evolved into something far more sophisticated than typical magical duels. They knew how they thought because they all thought the same way initially. The question became who could adapt fastest, who could break free from their shared patterns, and who could leverage resources most effectively. The battles for Zhentarim's strongholds began almost immediately. Gentle Keep, the heart of Zhentarim power and Manshoon's birthplace, became a contested site as multiple Manshoons converged on the fortress city. The keep had been Manshoon's primary base of operations for over a century, containing his most important research, his most powerful magical items, and the administrative infrastructure that controlled much of the Zhentarim network. Whoever controlled Gentle Keep would control a significant portion of the organization's core resources. Or so the logic went. When multiple Manshoons arrived at locations they all remembered as home, the resulting conflicts turned portions of Gentle Keep into a war zone. Based on what we know about the scale of the Clone Wars, magical confrontations would have erupted as competing Manshoons and their respective forces clashed. The Zhentarim soldiers and agents stationed at the keep faced an impossible choice. Some tried to remain neutral, barricading themselves in defensible positions and refusing to take sides until a clear victor emerged. Others made judgments based on which Manshoon they encountered first, which one seemed more legitimate, or which one controlled access to their resources and pay. The magical defenses of Gentle Keep, ironically designed by Manshoon himself, became a puzzle that multiple Manshoons tried to solve simultaneously. Each knew the wards, the pass phrases, the hidden entrances, and the security protocols. But knowing the defenses and controlling them were different matters. When one Manshoon reset the wards to lock out the others, they could find alternative routes or counter with spells designed to bypass protections they themselves had created. This could imply that the fortress became a bizarre maze, where every Manshoon knew all the secrets, making traditional advantages of insider knowledge meaningless. No single Manshoon managed to secure complete control of Gentle Keep, at least not permanently. The city itself would face destruction in later years during the events known as the Rage of Dragons in 1300 and 83 Dale Reckoning. Though this was unrelated to the Clone Wars. The ongoing conflicts and instability within the Zhentarim likely made the organization less capable of defending its holdings when external threats emerged. With Zhentarim Keep unstable and other major Zhentarim holdings contested, different Manshoons spread across Faerun to establish their own domains. The historical record confirms that multiple Manshoons survived and operated from different locations, though the specific details of how each secured their territories vary. What we can establish is that the clones adapted to circumstances in different ways, with some focusing on rebuilding Zhentarim cells in specific regions, while others pursued different strategies entirely. Darkhold, the massive fortress in the far hills that served as another major Zhentarim stronghold, remained under Semimon's control during this period. Semimon, Manshoon's former apprentice and lieutenant, had ruled Darkhold since 1312 Dale Reckoning, when Manshoon granted him the fortress after its conquest from the Lich Queen Varela. During the Clone Wars, Semimon appears to have maintained his independence, navigating the chaos by refusing to fully commit to any single Manshoon. This pragmatic approach allowed him to preserve his power base while the various clones fought among themselves. The Moonsea region, with its numerous cities and crucial trade routes, became a major theater of conflict as different Manshoons attempted to secure their loyalty and resources. The cities of Mulmaster, Hillsfar, and Flan all felt the impact of the Clone Wars, as Zhentarim operations in these locations fell into disarray. Local rulers found themselves receiving visits from multiple individuals claiming to be Manshoon, each demanding recognition, each threatening consequences for supporting their rivals. Some rulers tried to play both sides, promising loyalty to whichever Manshoon seemed ascendant at any given moment. Others picked a Manshoon and committed fully, gambling that their chosen clone would emerge victorious. One Manshoon established operations in Waterdeep, that great city of splendors on the Sword Coast. This particular clone spent years rebuilding Zhentarim operations within Waterdeep's criminal underworld. Waterdeep had always been a target for Zhentarim infiltration due to its wealth and political importance. And this Manshoon worked patiently to cultivate contacts among the city's thieves' guilds, smugglers, and corrupt elements of society. His approach suggested a shift towards subtlety and long-term planning, possibly shaped by the experiences of navigating the Clone Wars. As the clones spent more time active in the world, making independent decisions and having unique experiences, they began to develop subtle differences in personality and priority. They all started from the same baseline, the same memories and disposition up to the point of their creation. But their diverging circumstances pushed them in different directions. A Manshoon constantly fighting for survival against multiple rivals would naturally become more paranoid and aggressive. A Manshoon who secured a stable power base early could focus on consolidation and expansion. These were still all Manshoon at their core, but experience was beginning to create variance. The magical duels between Manshoons presented unique challenges. When you fight yourself, you face an opponent who knows exactly what spells you have prepared, who understands your tactics completely, and who can predict your responses based on what we know about Manshoon's capabilities as one of Faerun's most powerful archmages. These confrontations would have been battles not about superior magical knowledge, but about innovation and finding new applications for familiar spells. The psychological dimension of facing yourself, of trying to be unpredictable while confronting an opponent who knows exactly how you think, would have created unusual combat dynamics. These duels often ended in stalemate rather than decisive victory. When two Manshoons fought and depleted their magical resources, both would recognize that continuing would leave the victor too weakened to defend against other threats, whether from rival clones or external enemies. This pattern of mutual withdrawal after exhausting confrontations likely contributed to the Clone Wars lasting as long as they did. No single battle could produce a clear winner when both combatants possessed identical capabilities and understanding. Assassination became another tactic in the Clone Wars, though it presented its own complications when the target and assassin shared the same knowledge. Each Manshoon knew what protections they would use, what precautions they would take, and what vulnerabilities they would guard most carefully. This meant assassinations required either overwhelming force that could punch through all expected defenses, or creative approaches that exploited weaknesses the Manshoons might not realize they had. The historical record suggests multiple Manshoons died during this period through various means, though specific details are often unclear. The response from other powers in Faerun to the Clone Wars was mixed and complex. Some saw opportunity in the Zhentarim's internal chaos. The Harpers, longtime enemies of the Black Network, launched operations to further destabilize the organization and eliminate Zhentarim assets, while the clones were distracted. The Lord's Alliance, the cooperative organization of cities in the north and Sword Coast, moved to counter Zhentarim influence in their territories, finding it easier to push back now that the organization's leadership was fractured. But others recognized that a chaotic Zhentarim was potentially more dangerous than a unified one. At least when Manshoon had been a single individual with clear authority, his actions were somewhat predictable. Now there were multiple Manshoons, each pursuing their own vision of how to restore their power, and none of them coordinating with the others. This made the Zhentarim's behavior erratic and unpredictable. A city might negotiate terms with one Manshoon, only to have another Manshoon arrive weeks later, repudiating the agreement and demanding different concessions. The Red Wizards of Thay watched the Clone Wars with particular interest. Thay had long competed with the Zhentarim for influence in Faerun's eastern regions. And Manshoon himself had been a formidable rival for decades. Seeing him fractured into competing versions created both opportunity and concern. At least one Manshoon would later be documented operating in cooperation with Thayan interests, suggesting that some clones were willing to make accommodations with traditional rivals that would have been unthinkable to the original. In Waterdeep, the lords of the city dealt with Manshoon attempts to rebuild operations within their walls. Waterdeep had always been vigilant against Zhentarim infiltration, and the Clone Wars brought renewed attention from at least one clone who saw the city as a valuable prize. The city's defenses, both mundane and magical, had to adapt to the reality that the Zhentarim threat now came in multiple forms, each potentially operating independently. As months turned into years, and years into decades, the Clone Wars settled into a pattern of ongoing conflict. The initial chaos gave way to a more structured situation, where surviving Manshoons established their territories and spheres of influence. Weaker clones were eliminated through combat, treachery, or simple failure to secure adequate resources. The war had no clear end in sight, because every time one Manshoon seemed close to dominance, circumstances or other clones would pull him back down. The Zhentarim's lower ranks adapted to the new reality. Agents learned to ask which Manshoon they were working for and developed methods to distinguish between the major clones. Though none of the Manshoons accepted these designations, each still insisted they were simply Manshoon, the real one, the legitimate continuation of the original. But practical necessity required some way to differentiate between them, even if only informally. This fragmentation fundamentally altered the Zhentarim's character. What had been a hierarchical organization with clear chains of command became a loose network of semi-independent cells, each loyal to their particular Manshoon or operating autonomously. Coordination between cells became difficult to impossible. Major operations requiring cooperation across the organization became rare. The Zhentarim's effectiveness as a unified force declined dramatically, even as individual cells remained dangerous and well-resourced. Yet through all this chaos, the Clone Wars revealed something important about identity and consciousness. The Manshoons were not remaining identical despite their shared origin. Their diverging experiences were creating genuine differences in personality, priority, and approach. The question of which was the real Manshoon was becoming increasingly complicated because they were all becoming different people, even as they all remained fundamentally Manshoon. The war was not just about determining the true heir to an identity. It was about watching that identity fragment in real time, split by circumstance into variations that all claimed the same origin, but were slowly becoming distinct individuals. The Clone Wars would continue for decades, lasting from 1370 Dale, reckoning well into the 1400s and beyond. The conflict reshaped the Zhentarim permanently, transforming it from a tightly controlled organization into something more decentralized and chaotic. And through it all, the surviving Manshoons continued their separate existences, each pursuing their own path, each still convinced at some level that they were the genuine article, each carrying forward a piece of the legacy of one of Faerun's most notorious archmages. Section 4. The Philosophy of Identity and the Real Manshoon. The question haunting every Manshoon, every Zhentarim agent, and every philosopher who learned of the Clone Wars was deceptively simple. Which one was real? You might think this has an obvious answer. The original Manshoon died in 1370 Dale reckoning. So none of the clones were the real one, merely copies of someone who no longer existed. But this answer satisfies no one, least of all the clones themselves. Each one possessed every memory the original had, up to the point of their creation and last update. Each one had the same personality, the same magical knowledge, the same understanding of who Manshoon was. From the inside, from the subjective experience of being Manshoon, each clone was absolutely, undeniably real. Consider what it means to be yourself. Your identity is built on continuity of memory and consciousness. You are you because you remember being you yesterday, last week, last year. Your personality, your knowledge, your sense of self all derive from accumulated experience stored in memory. Now imagine that all those memories were perfectly copied into another body through clone magic. That copy would feel exactly like you from the inside. They would have your childhood memories, your learned skills, your relationships, your goals. They would not feel like a copy. They would feel like you, continuing to exist in a new body. This was the situation every Manshoon faced. Each clone had continuity with the original, at least up to the point where they were created. When they opened their eyes in their stasis chambers, they did not think, "I am a copy of Manshoon." They thought, "I am Manshoon, and I have just survived death through my contingency plan." The subjective experience of identity was identical across all clones. There was no internal marker saying, "You are the real one," or "You are merely a copy." They all felt equally authentic because, from a certain perspective, they all were equally authentic. The magical mechanics of clone creation added another layer to this question. In the cosmology of the D&D multiverse, souls are real, tangible things. When a person dies, their soul departs to the afterlife, to whichever plane their deity or alignment dictates. Clone spells create new bodies that can house a soul, but the soul itself must come from somewhere. So where did the souls animating the Manshoon clones come from? This question troubled magical theorists who studied the situation. Some scholars argued that each clone received a fragment of the original Manshoon's soul, shattered at the moment of death, and distributed across all the awakening bodies. This interpretation would make each clone a piece of the original, no one of them complete, but all of them together representing the whole that was Manshoon. If this theory were correct, then no single clone could claim to be the real Manshoon. They were all portions of him, and perhaps only by somehow merging back together could the complete person be restored. This remained purely theoretical speculation, as no evidence definitively supported or refuted the soul fragment hypothesis. Other scholars suggested that the clones received entirely new souls, fresh from the raw soul stuff of the cosmos, but imprinted with Manshoon's memories and personality through the clone magic. This would make each clone a new person who merely believed themselves to be Manshoon because they had his memories. By this interpretation, the real Manshoon died completely when his original body perished in 1370 Dale Reckoning. And what awakened were multiple new individuals suffering from a form of false identity, convinced they were someone they were not. A third theory proposed that one clone, probably the first to awaken, or the one most recently updated, received Manshoon's actual soul, while the others received soul fragments or new souls. This theory had the advantage of providing a clear answer to which Manshoon was real, but it raised the problem of identification. How could you tell which clone had the original soul? There was no known magical test that could definitively answer this question. All the clones read as alive and souled, and genuinely the person they claimed to be. The Manshoons themselves each developed their own justifications for why they specifically were the real one. The most common argument was based on continuity of consciousness. A Manshoon would reason that because he experienced an unbroken sense of self, because his consciousness felt continuous from the original's memories right up through awakening and beyond. He must be the legitimate continuation of that identity. This argument had intuitive appeal. After all, you know you are yourself because your consciousness feels continuous. You do not wake up each morning wondering if you are the same person who went to sleep, because your sense of self persists uninterrupted. But when multiple beings all made this same claim with equal conviction, the argument's weakness became apparent. Continuity of consciousness proved nothing when that continuity was manufactured through magical means. The clones had the illusion of continuity, the feeling of being Manshoon because they had his memories. But that subjective feeling did not establish objective truth about which one, if any, was genuinely the original consciousness continued. Some Manshoons based their claim on resource control and demonstrated capability. They argued that the real Manshoon would naturally be able to secure the most power, control the most Zhentarim assets, and demonstrate the greatest magical prowess. This was essentially a might makes right argument, suggesting that authenticity could be proven through dominance. If you were the real Manshoon, you would have the strategic brilliance, magical power, and force of personality to overcome all rivals. Therefore, the Manshoon who emerged victorious from the Clone Wars would prove himself real through the very act of winning. This argument had its own problems. It turned identity into a competition, suggesting that personhood could be earned or lost based on success in combat or politics. It also ignored the role of circumstance. A clone who happened to awaken in a well-supplied facility with easy access to resources had advantages that had nothing to do with authenticity. A clone who found himself in a remote location with minimal resources might be just as real, but disadvantaged by bad luck rather than lesser claim to identity. Other clones took a more philosophical approach, arguing that memory determined identity more than any other factor. They contended that since all clones had the same memories up to certain points, they were all equally Manshoon in the sense that mattered most. What made Manshoon who he was not some mystical essence of Manshoonness, but the accumulated experiences, knowledge, and personality traits stored in memory. Since the clones all shared this foundation, they were all Manshoon, just manifested in multiple bodies simultaneously. This view led to an interesting position. If all the clones were equally Manshoon, then the question of which one was real became meaningless. They were all real. The problem was not false clones versus a true original, but rather too many simultaneous instances of the same person. By this logic, the Clone Wars were not about determining authenticity, but about reducing redundancy, about winnowing down the number of Manshoons until only one remained, not because that one was more real, but simply because having multiple instances of the same person was untenable for practical reasons. You can see echoes of the ancient philosophical puzzle known as the ship of Theseus in Manshoon's situation. The puzzle asks, if you replace every plank in a ship one at a time until none of the original material remains, is it still the same ship? And if you then take all the old planks and rebuild the original configuration, which ship is the real one? Philosophers have debated this for millennia without reaching consensus, because it exposes fundamental questions about identity and continuity that have no clear answers. Manshoon's clones presented a variation on this puzzle. The original Manshoon was dead, his body destroyed, but his memories, personality, and knowledge continued in multiple new bodies. Were these continuations of the original person, or new people who merely had the original's memories? If you gradually replaced every atom in Manshoon's body over time through natural biological processes, he would remain Manshoon despite the material change. But if you instantly created duplicate bodies with the same mind, did those duplicates share his identity or merely copy it? The magical nature of the D&D universe added complications that the original ship of Theseus puzzle did not address. In a world where souls are real and magic can manipulate consciousness, identity becomes more than just a philosophical question. It has tangible, measurable components. Yet, even with magic's ability to detect and manipulate souls, the Manshoon question remained unresolved. Magic could confirm that each clone was alive and souled and possessed genuine memories. It could not determine which one, if any, was the true continuation of the original. As years passed and the clones accumulated different experiences, the question of identity became even more complex. Remember, the clones started identical, but began diverging almost immediately. They made different choices, faced different challenges, formed different alliances, and developed different priorities. These diverging experiences changed them, created variations in personality and approach that made each Manshoon slightly different from his brothers. One Manshoon might have faced near death several times, making him more cautious than the original. Another might have found unexpected success, making him more confident. A third might have been betrayed by someone he trusted, making him more cynical about alliances. These experiences shaped them, created new memories that they did not share with other clones, and gradually transformed them from identical copies into distinct individuals who happened to share a common origin. This divergence made the question, which is the real Manshoon, increasingly irrelevant over time. After decades of clone wars, was any of them still truly the same person who had died in 1300 and 70-Dale reckoning? They all had years of unique experiences, memories, and developments that the original never possessed. Based on what we know about how the Clone Wars lasted for an extended period, each Manshoon would have accumulated substantial individual history. In a sense, the original Manshoon was gone, and what remained were his descendants, children of magic rather than biology, each carrying part of his legacy, but none fully embodying the complete person he had been. Some Manshoons came to this realization and found it troubling, though we can only infer this from their subsequent actions. To accept that you were not quite the same person anymore, that you had diverged from your original identity, meant acknowledging that the person you thought you were had died after all. The continuity of self they had relied on for their sense of identity was broken, or at least questioned. Other Manshoons likely rejected this idea entirely, insisting that they were still completely Manshoon, that new experiences did not change core identity any more than living another year would change anyone's fundamental self. The philosophical debates about Manshoon's identity were not just abstract academic discussions. They had practical implications for how various parties treated the clones. If all the Manshoons were equally real, then killing one was no worse than killing any other. But if there was a true Manshoon and the rest were mere copies, then perhaps eliminating the copies was less problematic than killing the genuine article. Different factions within the Zhentarim and beyond adopted different positions on this question based on their own interests and philosophical leanings. The Harpers, in their campaigns against the Zhentarim, treated all Manshoons as equally legitimate targets. From their perspective, whether a Manshoon was the real one or a copy mattered less than the fact that they were all dangerous individuals working to expand the Black Network's influence. Each Manshoon was responsible for his own actions, regardless of his claim to being the original consciousness. The question of identity also affected how the Manshoons saw each other. Based on what we know about their continued conflicts, some clones likely developed grudging respect for their duplicates, recognizing in them the same intelligence and capability they possessed. They would have seen their fellow Manshoons as worthy opponents, the only beings in Faerun who could match their magical prowess and strategic thinking. Other clones likely viewed their duplicates with contempt or even horror, seeing in them either inferior copies or disturbing mirrors that challenged their sense of unique identity. This could imply there were moments where rivals met under truce to discuss the situation, though such meetings would have been rare and brief. Imagine confronting yourself, seeing your own face wearing your own expressions while claiming to be you, and knowing that from his perspective, you are the duplicate challenging his rightful identity. The cognitive dissonance of such encounters would have been profound. The inability to resolve the identity question definitively meant the Clone Wars could not end through consensus or logical argument. There would be no moment where all the Manshoons sat down, reasoned through the philosophy, and agreed on who was real. Instead, the conflict would persist until attrition, warfare, and circumstance reduced the population of clones to a manageable number or a single victor. Identity would be determined not by philosophical purity or magical authentication, but by survival and dominance. This brutal reality troubled some of the more introspective Manshoons, at least as we can infer from their later behavior. They recognized that they had become trapped in a war that had no clean resolution, fighting themselves for the right to be themselves, with no clear criteria for determining success beyond eliminating all rivals. It was absurd and tragic in equal measure. The very magic meant to ensure Manshoon's survival had instead created a situation where multiple Manshoons were guaranteed to die, killed by other versions of themselves in a conflict that might never truly end. The broader implications of the Manshoon situation extended beyond one wizard's identity crisis. The Clone Wars raised questions about the ethics and wisdom of clone magic generally. If creating multiple backup clones could lead to such chaos when something went wrong, what did that say about the practice? Some magical institutions likely proposed restrictions or oversight for clone magic, though the practice remained legal in most jurisdictions. The Manshoon clones themselves, despite their conflicts, inadvertently contributed to magical knowledge about identity and consciousness. Their existence provided real-world data about questions that had previously been purely theoretical. Scholars studying the situation learned much about how memory related to identity, how experiences shaped personality, and how consciousness persisted or fragmented under extraordinary circumstances. The Manshoons may have hated being studied like laboratory subjects, but they could not prevent scholars from observing and learning from their unique situation. In the end, the question which Manshoon was real had no single correct answer. Each perspective on the problem provided valid insights while also revealing limitations. The real Manshoon was whoever survived the Clone Wars. The real Manshoon was all of them simultaneously. The real Manshoon was none of them, dead with his original body. The real Manshoon was a philosophical category error, inapplicable to a situation where identity had fractured beyond traditional understanding. All these answers were true from different angles, which meant none of them fully captured the strange reality of what Manshoon had become. Section 5. Resolution, Survivors, and Lasting Impact. The Clone Wars did not end with a single decisive battle or dramatic confrontation. Instead, they gradually wound down through attrition, exhaustion, and the simple reality that maintaining perpetual warfare against yourself proved unsustainable even for beings as powerful as Manshoon. Over the decades following 1370 Dale Reckoning, the number of active Manshoons decreased steadily. Some died in magical duels with their duplicates. Others fell to assassination, either by rival clones or by external enemies who took advantage of the chaos. A few simply disappeared, their fates unknown, possibly killed or possibly gone into deep hiding to wait out the conflict. By the 1400s Dale Reckoning, the situation had stabilized somewhat, though stable is a relative term when discussing multiple versions of one person competing for dominance. The numerous original clones had been reduced to a handful of survivors, each controlling their own territory and resources, each still claiming to be the true Manshoon, but no longer actively engaged in constant warfare. An exhausted détente emerged, not from agreement or resolution, but from mutual recognition that continued fighting was depleting everyone's strength without producing victory. The most prominent surviving Manshoon established himself in Waterdeep, that great city of splendors on the Sword Coast. This particular clone had spent years, possibly decades, rebuilding Zhentarim operations within Waterdeep's criminal underworld. By the late 1400s Dale Reckoning, he had created a substantial power base in the city, operating from the shadows while cultivating contacts among thieves' guilds, smugglers, and corrupt elements of Waterhavian society. This Manshoon demonstrated patience and methodical planning, qualities that suggest his experiences during the Clone Wars taught him the value of subtlety over direct confrontation. The Waterdeep Manshoon's story took an unusual turn when he ventured into Undermountain, the vast dungeon complex beneath the city. There he encountered Halaster Blackcloak, the mad mage who controlled the dungeon. Halaster, being one of the few wizards in Faerun who could match or exceed Manshoon's power, captured this particular clone and imprisoned him within Undermountain's depths. Based on what we know about Halaster's eccentric nature and his tendency to collect interesting specimens, this imprisonment likely stemmed from the mad mage's curiosity about the clone phenomenon as much as any strategic consideration. However, this Manshoon eventually escaped or was released from Halaster's custody and returned to operating in Waterdeep. By 1492 Dale Reckoning, he had re-established his presence in the city, operating from an extra-dimensional sanctum and working to rebuild his influence. This Manshoon became involved in the hunt for a great treasure hidden somewhere in Waterdeep, competing against other powerful figures, including another villain, Zhentarim, and the Devil Zariel's agent. His activities during this period demonstrated that despite the Clone Wars and his imprisonment, he remained one of Faerun's most dangerous and capable wizards. Historical records suggest that at least 2 other significant Manshoons survived into the modern era, though details about them are less clear. One operated in regions of Faerun outside Waterdeep, working to rebuild Zhentarim holdings and restore something of the organization's former power. Another was documented cooperating with interests in Thay, having made accommodations with the Red Wizards that would have been unthinkable to the original Manshoon. This willingness to ally with traditional enemies suggests how much this particular clone's experiences had changed him, pushing him toward pragmatism over the original's prideful independence. There were persistent rumors of additional Manshoons in various locations, though confirming these reports proved difficult. Some claimed a Manshoon operated in the Underdark or in distant nations beyond Faerun. Whether these were genuine surviving clones, imposters taking advantage of the confusion, or simply mistaken identities remained unclear. The Clone Wars had created enough chaos around Manshoon's identity that distinguishing truth from rumor became nearly impossible. The question of which surviving Manshoon should be considered the primary or most legitimate version remained contentious and largely subjective. From an external perspective, the Waterdeep Manshoon garnered the most attention from adventurers and Faerun's power brokers, simply due to his location in such a prominent city and his involvement in high-profile schemes. Waterdeep's importance as a commercial and political hub meant that any major player operating there attracted scrutiny and recognition. This Manshoon's activities gave him higher visibility than his more reclusive counterparts. But visibility did not necessarily equal legitimacy. Other surviving Manshoons could argue their own claims based on different criteria. One focused on rebuilding the Zhentarim could claim that dedication to the organization aligned more closely with the original's priorities and vision. The organization had been central to Manshoon's identity and ambitions, and working to restore it represented a continuation of the original's life work. By this logic, the Manshoon most dedicated to the Zhentarim's success had the strongest claim to being the true heir to the original's identity and purpose. The reality, which even the surviving Manshoons grudgingly acknowledged in their more honest moments, was that none of them were quite the same person who had died back in 1370 Dale Reckoning. Over a century of divergent experiences had transformed them into related but distinct individuals. They shared a common origin, common memories up to various points, and common personality foundations. But they had become different people through the accumulation of unique experiences. The Waterdeep Manshoon was not the same person as the other surviving clones, even though they had all started as identical copies of the original. This reality forced a kind of implicit recognition among the survivors. They could not all be Manshoon in the complete sense because they had diverged too far. Instead, each had become a version of Manshoon, a variation on the original theme. Some accepted this more readily than others. The most adaptable clones embraced their unique identities while still honoring their origin as Manshoon. The more rigid ones continued to insist on complete identity with the original, though this position became harder to maintain as decades of separate existence accumulated. The Zhentarim itself underwent profound changes as a result of the Clone Wars. The organization that had been one of Faerun's most feared and unified powers fragmented into semi-independent cells and factions. Different groups maintained loyalty to different Manshoons, or to no Manshoon at all, having learned to operate autonomously during the chaos. Some Zhentarim cells flourished under this new decentralized model, finding freedom to pursue local opportunities without waiting for central approval. Others struggled without clear leadership and coordination. Over time, the Zhentarim adapted to its new reality. The organization became less hierarchical and more networked, with regional leaders enjoying substantial autonomy while maintaining loose connections to each other through shared history and mutual benefit. This transformation was not what the original Manshoon had envisioned when he founded the organization in 1261 Dale Reckoning. But it proved resilient in ways the old model had not been. When one cell was compromised or destroyed, others continued operating unaffected. The organization could no longer be decapitated because it no longer had a single head. Some Zhentarim members saw this as positive evolution, arguing that the Clone Wars had forced necessary adaptation that made the organization stronger and more sustainable. Others mourned the loss of unity and clear purpose, believing that without a single Manshoon to provide vision and leadership, the Zhentarim had lost its way. Both perspectives had validity, reflecting different values about what made the organization worthwhile. The surviving Manshoons maintained varying degrees of contact with each other. Based on what we know about their continued separate operations, some remained hostile, viewing any other Manshoon as a rival to be eventually eliminated. Others developed complicated relationships that mixed rivalry with reluctant respect. This could imply there were instances of Manshoons cooperating on specific projects when their interests aligned, though such cooperation would have been temporary and never fully trusted by either party. The magical and philosophical legacy of the Clone Wars extended far beyond Manshoon himself. The situation became a cautionary tale taught in magical academies across Faerun. Students learning clone spells heard about what happened when the magic malfunctioned spectacularly. Wizards planning their own contingencies against death took careful note of Manshoon's mistakes and designed their backup plans to avoid similar disasters. The clone spell itself became more carefully studied, with magical theorists working to understand exactly what had gone wrong with Manshoon's implementation. Philosophical schools incorporated the Manshoon situation into their debates about personal identity and consciousness. The question which Manshoon was real became a thought experiment used to explore the nature of selfhood and what constitutes personal continuity. Different philosophical traditions reached different conclusions, but all agreed that Manshoon's case revealed fundamental complexities about identity that simple answers could not capture. Religious institutions also drew lessons from the Clone Wars. Some churches used Manshoon's fate as evidence of the dangers of trying to cheat death through magic, rather than accepting natural mortality. Others saw it as demonstration that souls and identity were more complex than simple models suggested, requiring more sophisticated theological understanding. The gods themselves apparently took no direct action regarding the Manshoons, which some interpreted as divine indifference and others as recognition that the clones were all genuinely ensouled beings, deserving of the same moral status as any other person. The impact on Faerun's political landscape was subtle but significant. The Zhentarim's weakening created opportunities for other organizations to expand their influence in regions previously dominated by the Black Network. The Harpers increased their activities in areas they had been pushed out of. The Lord's Alliance strengthened its position in the north. Various independent criminal organizations moved into territories the Zhentarim could no longer control effectively. The power vacuum created by the Clone Wars reshaped underworld politics across the continent. Some regions actually benefited from the Zhentarim's internal struggles. Cities that had been under heavy Zhentarim influence found themselves with more autonomy and freedom of action as the organization's grip loosened. Trade routes that had been controlled by Zhentarim interests opened up to more competition. The clone conflict inadvertently created space for new powers to rise, and for existing powers to assert themselves more boldly. But the Zhentarim's decline also created instability in unexpected ways. The organization had provided a kind of order, even if it was the order of a criminal network. With that order disrupted, some regions descended into chaos as various factions fought to fill the void. The Clone Wars demonstrated that even malevolent organizations serve functions in the ecosystem of power, and their sudden weakening could have consequences, both positive and negative, depending on local circumstances. As Faerûn moved into the 1500s Dale Reckoning, the Clone Wars had largely ended in practical terms, though the philosophical questions they raised remained unresolved. The surviving Manshoons had established their separate domains and learned to coexist in an uneasy equilibrium. New generations of adventurers and power brokers encountered the various Manshoons without the context of the original conflict. Simply accepting that there were multiple individuals all claiming that name and identity. For them, the question of which was real mattered less than the practical reality of dealing with whichever Manshoon they encountered. The strangest aspect of the Clone Wars resolution was that it was not really a resolution at all. The central question, which Manshoon was genuine, was never answered definitively. Instead, the question simply stopped mattering as much as it once had. The surviving clones had lived separate lives for so long that their claim to be continuations of the original identity had been overtaken by their development into distinct individuals. They were all Manshoon in origin, but they had become themselves through lived experience. This outcome reveals something profound about identity in the D&D universe, and perhaps in reality generally. Identity is not static. It is not a fixed essence that persists unchanged through time. Instead, identity is process, a continuous construction built from accumulating experiences, choices, and changes. The original Manshoon died in 1370 Dale Reckoning, and what emerged from his clone network were multiple individuals who began as copies, but became unique people through the simple act of living separate lives. They were all Manshoon, and none of them were, depending on how you define the terms. The Clone Wars also demonstrated the limits of magical solutions to fundamental problems. Manshoon had tried to solve the problem of mortality through clone magic, to ensure that death would not end his existence. He succeeded in a technical sense. His consciousness did persist beyond the death of his original body. But the solution created problems worse than the original issue. Instead of one Manshoon living indefinitely, there were multiple Manshoons living in conflict, each diminished by the existence of the others, none able to claim the unified identity and clear purpose the original possessed. For adventurers and citizens of Faerûn in the current era, the practical lesson is straightforward. If you encounter someone claiming to be Manshoon, take the claim seriously regardless of which specific clone you are facing. Each surviving Manshoon is genuinely dangerous, genuinely intelligent, and genuinely capable of the kind of long-term scheming and powerful magic that made the original feared across the realms. The question of authenticity is less important than the reality of the threat or opportunity such an encounter represents. The Manshoon Clone Wars stand as one of the most bizarre and philosophically troubling incidents in Faerun's history. A powerful wizard's attempt to achieve immortality instead fractured his identity across multiple bodies and triggered over a century of self-inflicted warfare. The conflict revealed fundamental questions about consciousness, identity, and what makes a person real that continue to challenge both magical theorists and philosophers. And somewhere in Faerun, in Waterdeep's shadows and other locations across the realms, the surviving Manshoons continue their separate existences, each still convinced at some level that they have the best claim to authenticity, each carrying forward a piece of the legacy of one of the realm's most powerful and notorious wizards. The story of Manshoon's clones reminds us that identity is more fragile and more complex than we usually acknowledge. It shows that consciousness can be copied, but perhaps not truly duplicated, that personhood emerges from experience as much as from memory, and that the question of who we really are might not have simple answers. In trying to ensure he would live forever, Manshoon instead discovered that the self is not nearly as permanent or unified as we believe. His fate stands as warning and wonder both, a testament to magic's power and its inability to solve every problem without creating new ones. If you found this deep dive into one of Dungeons and Dragons' most fascinating identity crises compelling, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. There are countless stories lurking in the depths of D&D lore, tales of tragedy and triumph, of magic gone wrong and plans that succeeded too well. And I explore them all here in this same relaxed, detailed style. The multiverse is vast and strange, full of stories like Manshoon's that challenge our understanding of reality and identity. Join me as we continue uncovering these hidden histories together, one story at a time. Thank you for listening. And until next time, may your own identity remain safely singular.